Are you desperate to kick out the Tories in 2024? Have you got behind every trade union dispute that has declared enough is enough? But despite your anger, do you despair daily at Sir Keir Starmer's leadership of the Labour Party and his hostility to socialists? Are you angry about Labour's lack of support for those such as refugees and the LGBTQ plus community who need our support the very most? To know what you're against is a good start, but it is not good enough. We also need a strategy to rebuild the socialist left in British politics. If you share our despair and our anger, you are in the right place. You are listening to the Labour Left podcast, produced in association with Labour Hub. By interviewing a wide range of socialists on the front line, we plan to delve deep into what is wrong with British politics, but most of all, we want to badly misquote Keir Starmer, to have a laser-like focus on what we need to do to rebuild a mass socialist current in British politics. First up is our trial episode, where we look at the history of Brighton Labour Briefing. We think the magazine has a rich seam of gold which the Labour left can mine for lessons today. If you like what you hear, please subscribe on YouTube or your favourite podcast channel so you can hear our future episodes and all the interesting interviewees we've got lined up. Hit like, but most of all, tell us what you think. Debate and argument are the lifeblood of the socialist movement, so please get stuck in on social media. Now, sit back and enjoy a journey back into the Bennite 1980s. See what lessons you can mine from our opposition to the Falklands War, the miners' Great Strike of 1984-85, and finally, the Labour left's response to the Adams-McGuinness wing of the Republican movement, which led to the road to peace. Enjoy the Labour Left Trial Podcast. See you again. The 1980s left, the Brighton Labour Briefing legacy. 40 years ago, in February 1982, 10 people published a trial edition of Brighton Labour Briefing, and they asked on its front page, why Brighton Labour Briefing? Later that month, 70 people packed into a room in the Eagle pub in Brighton to answer the question they'd been set. What followed, as the magazine established it so, was a rich seam of gold which the Labour left can mine for ideas today. The circumstances, like today, were tough for the left. The Labour left's high point had occurred on the 27th of September 1981, when Denis Healey, who'd been the UK's first neoliberal chancellor, pipped Tony Benn to the Labour's deputy leadership post by a fraction of a percentage point. With the right wing in the saddle and Michael Foot as leader, a willing prisoner, the context we faced was a Labour Party in which Peter Tatchell had been removed as Labour candidate for Bermondsey. The witch hunt was bearing down on the militant tendency, and Tariq Ali had been refused entry into the Labour Party. Healey had just announced he would not serve in a Labour cabinet if it was committed to nuclear disarmament. The situation in the party was going to get a whole lot worse, but it already felt pretty bad. The situation in 2023 Labour today is nothing new. I'm afraid the Labour left veterans have seen it all before. What attracted 70 Labour Party activists to the Eagle pub launch meeting was a curiosity about a new group that promised to do politics differently. The new magazine was to be broad, pluralist, and a notice board of the left. We wanted to set about building alliances and creating coalitions rather than making enemies. Anyone could attend our meetings and everyone had the right to reply. In the front page article, Why Labour Briefing, the authors proudly announced, it is in the spirit of London Labour Briefing that we intend to work and to organise. It has, to use a popular phrase, broken the mould of empty sloganising and jargonised language. Editorial comment is to be kept to a minimum and written by those activists who attend the fully publicised and open meetings. Articles written by individual party members are never subject to political censorship. There is an automatic right of reply. We see ourselves as part of a national network of briefing groups being set up around the country. Brighton Labour Briefing's openness was crucial to its success, earning the trust and respect of Brighton activists inside and outside the Labour Party. We made a virtue of parading our differences and had debates, which was something of a revelation to those scarred by the dead hand of the Leninist tradition.
We believe that the magazine could make the left materially stronger by always trying to build alliances rather than constantly seeking out the latest heretic. The notice board of the left had the effect of showing left activists how strong we really were and how many others shared our politics. We placed more emphasis on the power of information than the need for ever narrowed ideological clarification. However, our attitude to the right-wing leadership, ensconced in Walworth Road's Labour HQ at the time, was rather different and less forgiving. During Brighton Labour briefing's short life, we faced major tests for our political method, so our legacy is best understood by looking at how we responded to the big moments of the period. The four big moments I have chosen are the Falklands War, the 1983 general election, the miners' strike of 1984-85, and the Brighton bombing of 1984. The Falklands War. The Falklands War was a huge issue in the 1980s Labour Party. The Argentinian military dictator, General Galtieri, faced with political difficulties on the home front, had invaded the Falkland Islands to help shore up his political position. It was odd that the Malvinas, as the Argentines called them, were British, given that they were on the other side of the world, and he hoped that a bit of nationalistic posturing could do him good. Thatcher responded by adopting a full-on Churchillian response to the defence of an island nobody had heard of before the naval fleet was dispatched. Tony Benn responded, as any reasonable person would, with calls for a negotiated settlement and the involvement of the United Nations. The Labour leader, Michael Foot, had other ideas. Brighton Labour briefing wrote, Jingoists in the leadership of our party accused the left of an abject defeatism in the face of a fascist junta. Certainly, there is an abject defeatism involved in here, but not on the part of the left. Abjectly, with hardly more than a shot fired in the debate, bring in the UN, but not now. Maybe the day after tomorrow. Labour's official spokespersons have crumbled, indeed collapsed, before a fait accompli of the British fleet steaming ahead to defend its rocky remnant of empire. This is political defeatism. But already the ideological struggle to create an independent working class and socialist response is underway, not only from Tony Benn, Judith Hart and our European members of Parliament, but also from within Brighton Labour Party. At a meeting of Queen's Park Ward, a motion to be forwarded to the General Management Committee called for an end to the Labour-Tory cooperation in the crisis, British military withdrawal, and castigated the colonialist adventurism. The motion gained over 20 votes and was in fact passed nem. Com. We had passed our first big test with flying colours, but what came next was our first attempt to build alliances in practice to strengthen the anti-war movement. First, we won the debate in the Brighton Labour Party that our stance should be no war, stop the fleet. Then we helped organise a successful demonstration with the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, local churches, women's groups and students' unions. Within our group and amongst our allies, there were political differences on the characterisation of the Argentinian dictatorship, different views of pacifism and the legitimacy of the Argentinian claim, but we were all united to protest and say, no war, stop the fleet. In the Brighton Labour Party, the politics became more complicated when, despite local Labour Party policy, the Executive Committee refused to back the protest. We wrote, the supporters of Labour briefing do not believe that the party has to be bureaucratic and incapable of organising activity. But this is the impression given to large numbers of people in the peace movement who supported last month's No War, Stop the Fleet demonstration in Brighton. By refusing to give support to the ad hoc committee in Brighton, the party lost a unique opportunity to be involved in a highly successful demonstration, which was in line with the three motions passed at last month's General Committee meeting. At the executive meeting, militants struck up an unholy alliance with the people in favour of Thatcher's fleet to ensure there was no official Brighton Labour Party at the march. Ray Apps, a leading militant supporter, made the accusation at the EC meeting that the march would support Argentina. He stated that at least 5 of the organisation supported Argentina. When challenged, he declined to state exactly which church, peace or women's group he meant. The militant tendency failed to oppose the war, while others on the left adopted the absurd stance of not working with anyone who did not back their support for the Argentinian claim. Brighton Labour Briefing had prioritised unity in action to stop the war. Our credentials were further established. Brighton Labour Briefing did not pull any punches with regard to Michael Foot. In an article entitled "Foot Sticks the Boot In," we wrote, as news of Thatcher's victory in the Malvinas was announced in the Commons, Foot offered his congratulations to the Tory government, a government which had spent millions in an imperialist venture, which results in hundreds of deaths whilst refusing to pay the nurses, is not worthy of the Labour leader's support. Michael Foot's leadership is normally and finally vacillating, incoherent, and above all unconvincing. But to align ourselves with the Tories is unforgivable. The cartoon spelt out the problem. Foot was an inveterate peacemonger, except in times of war. The 1983 general election. Our next challenge was to be how we were going to approach the 1983 general election. It was obvious to any fool that we wanted Labour to defeat Margaret Thatcher's Tories, but then, as now, the Labour leadership was not an attractive proposition. In our 10th edition, we announced that Jeremy Corbyn, a National Union of Public Employers, the forerunner of today's Unison, full-timer and Labour briefing supporter, was to address our next public meeting. Jeremy was a prospective parliamentary candidate in Islington North, and he looked like the kind of Labour MP we wanted. We wrote, "Class struggle cannot be called off for the duration of an election year. The fight against the witch hunt and the attack on socialist policy cannot be ignored. Indeed, our task is, as always, to organise the most militant sections of the Labour movement. The strategy of the left in this general election should be to organise behind conference policy. We must say to people, vote Labour, but prepare to fight. A campaign of constituency Labour parties, trade unions, shop stewards organisations and local left caucuses should be on the streets pointing to the need to develop the Labour Party into a force which can challenge the Tories and their ruling class paymasters. Today, some of the left are struggling with the notion of remaining in the Labour Party and campaigning for Labour victory. Our approach in 1983 focused us on the immediate task of defeating Thatcher, whilst refusing to put our support for struggles that were actually taking place on ice. The April 1983 edition of Brighton Labour Briefing led with the headlines "Socialist for Labour Victory," but inside, in line with our open editorial policy, we allowed a local Labour Party member to put the case for keeping our mouths shut for the election period. In May 1983, we also announced a Socialist for Labour Victory meeting with a Greenham Common Peace campaigner, the late Stan Fall MP, a former militant trades unionist, and the Brighton Pavilion Labour candidate. The Socialist for Labour Victory approach demonstrated how it was not only possible to support Labour while supporting local struggles and challenging the leadership, it is essential. Supporters of the Breakthrough Party, the Northern Independence Party, the Socialist Labour Party, and the Trade Union Socialist Coalition, please take note. There is more to a socialist strategy than vying with the monster raving loony party to avoid last place. The miners' strike. The biggest moment in Brighton Labour Briefing's short life was the miners' strike, the Great Strike of 1984 to 1985. Early in the strike, Brighton Labour Briefing supporters visited the local miners' picket at Shoreham, and in May 1984, our front page led with "Miners must win." By the summer of 1984, it was clear that the strike was going to be a long war of attrition, and leaving solidarity to the local trades council would not be enough. Brighton Labour Briefing supporters took a motion to the local Labour Party to set up a Brighton Labour Party miners' support group, and we reported in the magazine that, at its general committee, Brighton Labour Party set up a miners' support group to complement the activities of the Trades Council. The group will attempt to coordinate Labour Party activity in support of the miners and widen the number of people involved beyond the existing activists. What followed was an explosion of activity to help sustain the mining communities. Well-attended meetings took place on a weekly basis in the Labour HQ at Lewis Road. The minor support group built on the excellent examples of the Labour Party women's section and organised food collections every Saturday throughout the town, which took place every week until the end of the strike. Each meeting was focused on action, providing accommodation for pickets, organising benefits, attending pickets at Shoreham, holding a fringe meeting at the Trade Union Congress held in the town, and sending delegations to the mining villages. The miners' support group was chaired by myself, a Brighton Labour briefing supporter, and the activity was so intense that we were allocated Dave Newell, a Kent NUM activist who moved into our house. Brighton Labour briefing's coverage was dominated by the strike, and as usual, the Labour leadership was found wanting. By October 1984, our front page dubbed the year Kinnock's Year of Shame. Dave Newell, the Kent miner, was interviewed, and when asked about the Labour Party's support, he said, "I didn't know we were getting support from Kinnock and the rest. The rank and file of the party is divorced from the leadership on this issue. Fantastic support from Labour members and no support from the leadership." Moving on to the future, Dave Newell of the NUM was clearly focused on the importance of the Labour Party. He said, "We've got to get the Labour Party sorted out and get some decent people in before we get the chance of a decent government. We've got to make the Labour Party responsive to the workers, one which doesn't go along with the capitalists." The miners' strike did much to form our politics. Today, the trade unions move into action again. We need to be ready to respond with a similar intensity if the strikes are prolonged. The parallels with today's encouraging waves of strikes and the Labour leadership's response are all for there to see. The Brighton Bombing. In the 1980s, the British occupation of the north of Ireland was a major issue, but much of the left ignored the situation as it was deemed to be too difficult, but not Brighton Labour briefing. Opinions differed widely within Brighton Labour briefing, but there was generally a view that partition and occupation were part of the problem, not the solution. Within the Republican movement, a current around the likes of Gerry Adams, Danny Morrison and Martin McGuinness was emerging that wanted to move beyond military struggle. The Republican movement was systematically silenced, and Brighton Labour briefing felt that if an opportunity for peace was possible, it was our role on the British left to give those Republicans an opportunity to start a dialogue with the Labour left. At the time, Neil Kinnock, the Labour leader, supported the ban on any Republican voices being heard, but Brighton Labour briefing was an early advocate of starting a conversation. Alongside left MPs like Joe Maynard, Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn, and campaigns like the Labour Committee on Ireland and the Troops Out movement, Brighton Labour briefing sought to establish a dialogue for peace. The dialogue with Sinn Féin eventually resulted in the peace deal, which, if it wasn't for the Iraq War, could have been Blair's legacy. In November 1982, Brighton Labour briefing reported on its role at that year's Labour Party conference. The invitation of Gerry Adams and women's representative of Sinn Féin by the Labour Committee on Ireland packed out the Corn Exchange at the largest fringe meeting of the Labour Party conference week. In spite of droves of journalists and cameramen present for a lengthy press conference before and throughout the meeting, there was no coverage on local or national TV, and only the barest mention of the meeting in the press. What coverage there was concentrated on alleged plots by Gerry Adams to get into the Labour Party conference hall, while the Argus seemed to attach symbolic significance to the details, such as a large black dog launching and lunging itself at Gerry Adams on his way to the Labour Committee on Ireland meeting. The content of the speeches made by the representatives was such as to leave the media with nothing condemnatory to say. Any coverage without flagrant distortion would only serve to further the cause of Sinn Féin. After the meeting, Gerry Adams visited the house of a Brighton Labour briefing supporter to meet local activists and eat a well-earned pizza. The all-important dialogue was being nourished. The Adams visit was not the end of Brighton Labour briefing's coverage of Ireland, as articles about the abuse of civil liberties such as strip searches and plastic bullets became a regular feature. Then, on the 12th of October 1984, an event of historic importance occurred in our town when the IRA bombed the Grand Hotel in the middle of the Conservative Party conference. Councillor Richard Stanton, a member of the Labour group in Brighton, was a regular contributor at the time to Brighton Labour Briefing and a supporter of troops out. Asked by the Argus, the local Brighton paper, to condemn the bombing, he refused to do so, putting the bombing in the context of what he called a 15-year British occupation. A full-page article, "The Grand Hotel Bomb, Why I Don't Condemn It," appeared in the 1984 Brighton Labour Briefing edition, where Councillor Richard Stanton was able to explain his position. He wrote, "My statement to the Argus on the 18th of November 1984 includes the following. I abhor violence, but I personally feel the Republican movement is entitled to use force against the British state as part of the war we started. I stand by it, every word. I stand by my decision to say it then publicly." Not every Brighton Labour Briefing supporter agreed with Councillor Richard Stanton's stance. I didn't, for one. But when calls were made to remove him as a local councillor, we sprang to his defence. In the July 1985 edition of Brighton Labour Briefing, we issued a Defend Richard Stanton, No Witch Hunt editorial statement. By August 1985, Brighton Labour Briefing was able to report that the resign calls had been crushed. The defeat of the attempt to remove Councillor Richard Stanton was not brought about because people agreed with him. Most people did not. It was because the argument was won that different voices on the Irish question should be heard. The very positive outcome of the dispute was that it was decided to organise a Brighton Labour Party fact-finding delegation to Belfast to find out more for ourselves. I was part of that delegation and we met a wide range of people to inform ourselves. I personally met the Social Democratic and Labour Party, the official Unionist Party, residents from the Divis flats, families of those killed by plastic bullets, Sinn Féin and People's Democracy. We all came back with our views on what was actually happening. Ireland, and our views were completely changed. The legacy of the delegation was the transformation of the discussion of Ireland in Brighton Labour Party. Dialogue and discussion had done its job. Brighton Labour Briefing had played a small part in establishing and then defending the dialogue with Sinn Féin, which opened the door to peace. With more senior politicians, including Tony Blair and Molan, able to walk through the door to peace, and this bore fruit.
The Brighton Labour Briefing story is about one of many local briefing magazines. Over time, local magazines came and went. To my knowledge, in London, Merseyside, Devon, Manchester, Strathclyde, West Midlands, Bristol, Nottingham, Oxford, Hull and Stoke. For a period, Brighton Labour Briefing teamed up with party members in Horsham, Hastings, Hove, Mid-Sussex, Crawley and Lewis. Over time, the local briefings faded away, and Labour Briefing's heyday is widely recognised as Mike Marquez's stint in the late 1980s and early 1990s as editor of a national magazine. Mike was without doubt one of the left's most outstanding editors, but for me, the period of local briefings with a national supplement was the high point of our influence. Labour Briefing, as a magazine, has recently come to an end, although a small sprinter group forges on. In the last few years, Labour Briefing was a mere shadow of its former self, and it had unlearned all the lessons that had once made it so successful. It lives on as a YouTube channel, and no one would ever suggest it was broad, pluralist, a notice board of the left, or had any desire whatsoever to set about building alliances and creating coalitions rather than making enemies. Its recent coverage of the Labour left's response to anti-Semitism came across as the Millwall of the Labour left. For non-football fans, their infamous chant is, "Nobody likes us and we don't care." I think I can end on a positive roll. The Labour left has more assets at its disposal than at any point in my lifetime. Where once London Labour Briefing inspired local groups across the country, we now have momentum. The biggest and most impressive Labour group of my lifetime. We may not have a journal, but we do have Labour Hub and the superb YouTube and podcast output from the likes of Navarra, Doubleday News and Owen Jones. The need for long-form discussion is covered by Tribune, Red Pepper and the Left Book Club. The World Transformed has got political education covered, and the campaign for Labour Party democracy continues to play its important role. Most recently, the Labour left's links with the trade unions have deepened with the creation of Enough is Enough. One ingredient we lack today is a local media output from the local Momentum and Labour left activists. There's no point in complaining about the mass media. We must make our own. Could we go full circle? Could Navarra, Double Down News and Owen Jones help create local groups with their own YouTube and podcast outlets to complement their brilliant national output? Now, that would be a project, a worthwhile project, which would definitely be in the beautiful spirit of Brighton Labour briefing. Thanks for listening to the trial episode of the Labour Left podcast. It was brought to you by myself, Bryn Griffiths, and Luke Robinson, the podcast editor. We're both activists in the Labour movement, Momentum and the World Transformed in North Essex. The Labour Left podcast is produced in association with our friends at Labour Hub, whose aim is to flesh out socialist ideas, to critique their opponents and their approach, and to provide informed updates about events in the Labour movement. We hope our podcast will live up to their aims. Our next episode will be an interview with our comrade Liz Davis, who will talk about her experience as dissenter in Blair's New Labour. We hope activists will learn from her experience and take what they learn into Starmer's party. The podcast will be available on the first day of Labour conference. Finally, please help us promote the podcast by subscribing, hitting the like button and giving us feedback. Solidarity, comrades.